Hello, my name is Kent Weir, and I'm here to talk to you today about LogicApps. In this video, we will walk through integrating custom SharePoint lists with SalesForce. If you're interested in following me on Twitter, my handle is @Weirzy, and this blog is middlewareinthecloud.com. In terms of what you'll need for this demo, you will need SharePoint Server 2013, although this will work with SharePoint Online. For the purpose of this video, we will be using the on-premise version of SharePoint. Within SharePoint, we're going to create a custom list. Next, we're going to need an Azure account to access the Azure portal, where we will provision a SharePoint Server connector, which is also known as an API app. As part of this connector, we will use the hybrid connection feature that allows us to bridge the cloud with our on-premise SharePoint server. Next, we will use the SalesForce connector to create a contact inside of that environment. And lastly, we will use a Logic app that will allow us to tie these two connectors together. So here's a high-level architecture view of our solution. Here's our Logic app, which is going to pull this on-premise SharePoint Server Custom List every minute and pull back any new contacts from that SharePoint list and create a contact inside of SalesForce. So let's now take a closer look at how to build this solution. I am now in the preview version of the Microsoft Azure portal. And I'm going to go ahead and create a Logic app, and I can do so by clicking on New, Web and Mobile, Logic app. I want to provide a name for this, so I'm going to call it Blog Post SharePoint to Salesforce. Note, I am using a resource group that belongs to the standard tier. And the reason for this is that when I set up my Logic app, I want to go ahead and pull my SharePoint server every minute. Now in the basic tier, the finest granularity is 1 hour. So I don't want to wait 1 hour for anything to be triggered. So in this case, I'm going to use the standard tier. And there is a price implication to doing this, so that is something to be aware of when creating your Logic app. Now I'm going to click on the Create button. And after a minute or so, we're going to see that my Logic app has been provisioned inside of the portal. My Logic app has now been created, and I'm in the properties view of this particular Logic app. To take a look at my canvas, I can click on the triggers and actions box. In here, we'll have a blank canvas. Now, as you can see, there's only two connectors that are part of my existing resource group, and that's HTTP and recurrence. Now, we're not interested in using these particular connectors in this video. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and add a SharePoint Server connector by clicking on it. Now, in this case, what's happening is I now need to provide some configuration information. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by getting the URL from my SharePoint site. I need to provide authentication mode. In this case, it's going to be Windows Authentication, a domain user. I'm going to provide my password, the document library location, which in this case is going to be lists contact. And I also need to provide a service bus connection string. And the reason for this, we're going to use a hybrid connection in order to bridge the Azure cloud with our on-premise data center. In order to get my service bus connection, what I've done is I've gone into the current production Azure portal, provisioned a service bus namespace, and now I can click on the connection information and go ahead and copy my SAS token. I'll head back over to the Logic app, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my service bus connection string text box. After that, I want to click on the green checkbox. And what's happening behind the scenes here is that we're going to be reaching out to our on-premise server in order to retrieve some metadata. Now, we haven't set up the hybrid connector yet, so this will fail as it won't be able to reach out to my on-premise solution. So as expected, we're unable to reach our on-premise endpoint. So what we can go ahead and do is go to Home, click on Browse, API Apps, find our SharePoint connector, which in this case is in the North Central US. Go ahead and click on that item. And we'll notice that there's this hybrid connection, testing connection box highlighted. And as you can see, it is considered incomplete. So we can go ahead and click on that. And what will happen is that we have a new blade showing up, which is going to prompt us to download the on-premise hybrid connection manager. So we'll go ahead and click that link, and then we'll see this download. It's approximately 6 megs, so it's not too big. Now we're being prompted to enter our relay listen connection string. So this would be our service bus relay. And we can grab this information right from this primary configuration string. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, paste it in here. And after a few moments, we're going to have this agent installed on our on-premise server or machine. The wizard has finished running, and we can see that the agent has been successfully installed. So I'm going to click on Close. I can now head back to my Logic app, click on Triggers and Actions, and since I didn't save it before, the connector's not showing up, but I can go ahead and click this, and now we should see that it connects successfully since we've set up our hybrid connection. Now this card is context aware. It has been able to contact our SharePoint list, which is called Contact. And what it's looking for is it wants us to choose a trigger, which in this case will be based on a new item being inserted into our contact list inside of SharePoint. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. I'm going to change this frequency to minutes. The interval in this case will be 1. This is a bit of an undocumented feature, at least at this point, from what I've seen, is that if I don't provide this archive location, this will fail. So I would consider this to be a mandatory field. Now the reason for this is within our SharePoint list, we are going to have, we're going to populate the SharePoint list with data. And then what's going to happen is that it's going to get picked up from the Logic app. Now in order to prevent duplicate messages from being processed, the Logic app wants to move or copy this data into another list, which in this case is going to be a mirror of it called archive list. So that's why we need to provide this name as part of that configuration. And when we run the demo, we'll see how our data gets moved into this particular list. So I'm going to provide archive list, and now we can click on the green check mark to continue. I guess I'll show you a couple other fields. So we also have the ability to query a view name. And if we really want to get fancy, we can use SharePoint's camel query language that will allow us more complex polling statements. After clicking on the green check mark, we can now see the different data elements that make up our SharePoint list. So with that in place, we're now going to provision our SalesForce connector. And since there is no hybrid connection, this is going to be a little bit simpler. So you can see the different SalesForce entities that are available to us. Our SalesForce connector has now been provisioned, and we need to authorize LogicApps to use it. So this is my SalesForce account. I'm simply going to log in here. And now LogicApps will be able to call the SalesForce API using the credentials that I just provided. These are the different actions that we're able to call upon. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to create a contact. So I can click on Create Contact, and we'll see all of the different data elements that make up that particular Salesforce entity. So in this case, what I want to do is some very simple mapping between my response that I'll receive from the SharePoint connector and pass that along to the request that'll be used in the Salesforce connector. So I can click on last name and I should be able to find surname. First name is just going to be name. Business phone will be phone number. Email will be email address. I think there's an address that we need to put in here as well. So in this case, we'll do mailing street, and that will be our address. Once we're done populating all of these different fields, we'll click the green check mark. And at this point, we now have configured our Logic app. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now what we can do is go back to our main configuration page for this particular Logic app, where we will find that this Logic app will get triggered once per minute. Now, one thing I did learn from the product group after a discussion recently was that you don't want to use the run now when you are using a trigger as an inbound connector. So in this case, SharePoint has its own inbound trigger. And what happens when you use the Run Now button is it'll actually skip the initial card that makes up your Logic app. So if you had recurrence as being the first step in your Logic app flow, that would be okay. But in this particular scenario, we do not want that step to be skipped, because what will happen is that we'll end up passing data over null data over to the Salesforce connector, and that's going to fail. So if we click on trigger history, we will see the history of all of our recent triggers. Now in this case, the call status is skipped because we have no data. So let's now go into our contact SharePoint list. We're going to create a new item, which in this case we will call it Mr. Derek Jeter, the famous New York Yankee. We'll say he lives on 777 Broadway. I don't know what his phone number is, but we'll just go with this. Email address, obviously fictitious. So we can go ahead and save this into our SharePoint list. We can now see our Derek Jeter item saved in our contact list. Who has fired, it has succeeded, and we can drill down. So what we can do is click on the inputs link, and what we'll see is the request that's being made over to our custom list, and we will see the JSON that's being retrieved from SharePoint and being sent over to our Logic app. If we head over to Salesforce, we click on Contacts, New This Week, we will see Derek Jeter. And in this case, we have the information that appeared in our SharePoint site. If we go back to our SharePoint site, we refresh this, we will see that Derek Jeter is no longer in the contact list, but if we go to the archive list, sure enough, we do find that Derek Jeter is there. So all in all, this is extremely powerful, considering we wrote no code in order to make this work. I think if you've done any sort of BizTalk SharePoint integration in the past, you'll notice that it is a bit cumbersome at times, where you need to consume that ASMX WSDL that's part of the older SharePoint API. You now need to manage those schemas within inside of BizTalk. Similarly, from a Salesforce perspective, you can certainly use the Enterprise WSDL that's part of that API, but you're generally doing a lot of building and configuring, and there's a lot of moving pieces, as opposed to a very simple workflow such as this, where we're just using straight configuration. So all in all, I hope you found this one interesting, and check back for more Logic Apps on middlewareinthecloud.com.